محمد وعجل فرجهم. Dear brothers, sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And thank you for joining us once again in our series, Life, the Islamic Answer. You'll remember that we were discussing the general heading of the community of knowledge in Islam. And we were, within that heading, looking specifically at those who make up that type of community. And we said that community is made up of those who want to learn, those who have something to teach. We specifically spent a bit more time on the youth or the children, on families, on women, and we said ultimately the community of knowledge Islamically has to be inclusive of everyone in the community. But we said if we're spending a bit more time on some of these actors or some of these agents or people in that community, it's either because our religion has emphasized their role and provided more teachings about them, or because we have a need as communities to look into their role a little bit more. And so in that lens, or from that lens, we also wanted to spend a bit more time on a question that arose a couple of centuries ago in the West and in the Islamic world that can be directly relevant to the topic of who belongs to a community of knowledge and what their role is, and that is the intellectual. The person who is not an expert in Islamic sciences, perhaps no formal education or expertise or specialization in any of the Islamic fields, but someone who wants to be intellectually engaged in Islam in general, or the work of the community as it happens now, or thinking about its future. So anyone who is willing to engage in that type of thinking and activity, if they have any interest, then they start to belong to this definition of the intellectual. And then of course, if we add to it that they perhaps come with other types of expertise, other intellectual or cognitive tools, then of course they become the definition that everyone would agree on, that they are in fact an intellectual. So I believe that this is perhaps the fifth or sixth discussion that we have on the role of the intellectual in the community. And the discussion had to begin, as we said, from what the Western thinkers have said about this topic. And the reason for this is, from one angle, that this is a very new question for us and our communities. This is not a question that we find in our classical, traditional scholarship in Islam. Who is the intellectual and what their role is in the community? That term, and therefore that notion, that concept of the intellectual, did not exist in this way centuries ago. And so therefore we have to see where we can get the tools, the analytical tools, to allow us to address this question and to think about it, to analyze it, and to reach some conclusions. And then two, we saw that in the West, there is something that must have happened that led them to start having to think about who is the intellectual and what is their role in society. And if we look at, generally speaking, the evolution of this discussion, we see that it emerges at a certain point in time in the West, perhaps around the Enlightenment, and we discussed what that means. And then, not that long afterwards, we start to see the emergence of similar types of questions and discussions in the Islamic world, which tells us that perhaps whatever led to the need to start discussing who is an intellectual and what is their role in the West at least overlaps with what happened in the Islamic world. Perhaps there is a relationship. Perhaps there are similar causes that forced both of these worlds to start thinking about who is the intellectual and what their role is. And then when we went through some of the major milestones and socio-political, economic, cultural, religious transformations that took place, we could see that some of them were the same. Of course, their details and the manner in which they manifested themselves is going to be different in the Islamic world and in the Western world. But as a new reality, both were experiencing that reality. They were simply experiencing it in a different way. And then, of course, there were things that were much more specific to the West and things that were much more specific to the Islamic world. And so, if the West is having to struggle and deal with an issue that forces it to have to think about a new role and what that means, and those same causes and that same context is starting to appear even partially in the Islamic world, then perhaps there is something that we can benefit from their thinking and their analysis and their discussion about all of this. That was the second point. And then, in addition to all of this, the third reason why we were interested to look at what the West has to say about all of this is that in today's world where we live, we do not fully belong to the West and we do not fully belong to the Islamic world. For us specifically, we have a heritage from the Islamic world to various degrees, depending on whether we are first generation or newcomers or second generation or third generation. We are going to carry a heritage that comes to us from the Islamic world. But for many of us, we have lived a portion of our lives in the West. We continue to live in the West. Many of us have been born in the West. And so there is certainly a part of our identity, of our thinking, of our worldview that is affected by living in the West. So we are not entirely only one or the other. We are a mix of both. And so if we want to build our communities today, we have to take all of this into consideration. We have to see what the West has done in its thinking and its analysis when it comes to, for instance, the role of an intellectual in society or for us in a community. And then we see what Islamic literature and Islamic thinking has reached as conclusions around this question. And then for us to see what is relevant from both of these discussions, because all of this has to converge into us, into our communities. Communities that are made up of Muslims, of believers who live in the West in a situation of minority. All of this has to be part of the thinking. We cannot isolate it entirely from one or the other of these types of heritage that have fed and that have kind of supplied the thinking and the analysis to this question. That's why we looked at it from that angle. And so when we went through some of the thinking that has taken place after looking into the major milestones that were experienced around the world, we started to be able to extract a few themes so that we make the discussion a little bit more controlled and limited. We focus on a few target questions that allow us to properly think about this issue. And so, alaykum assalam wa rahmatullah, we were able to identify three big themes. We said that if we understand these three big themes properly, we can claim to have a very good idea. We're not going to say it fully catches everything, but it would give us a very good idea of the majority of the thinking that has taken place in the West with regards to the role of the intellectual. So what are these three big themes? The first one, and we discussed it, is the theme of power structures. And we said that there's many thinkers who, when they looked at the role of the intellectual, either directly, like that was their main primary question, or indirectly, They were talking about or thinking about other questions, but that can be applied to the role of the intellectual. Their lens, their contribution, their focus was what makes up power in a society. Where does power come from? And so we referred to all of this as power structures. And we said power here is in the social sense, right? The political sense and the social sense. That was one discussion. And when we apply it directly to the intellectual, this means, where is the intellectual in the power structure in society? Is the intellectual contributing to the existing power structures? Does the intellectual enable, empower, enforce, solidify the existing power structures? Or are they neutral? They do not contribute and they do not fight? Or are they fighting the power structures? Where does the intellectual fall? A lot of the discussion had to do with those types of questions, and that's how the theme, that first theme of the power structures applies to the intellectual. And we saw that in the West, there's major thinkers who spent a lot of time on this. The power structures in society, and where does the intellectual fit in? And of course, we always add, and some went one step further and say, where should the intellectual fit in? Because these are two, as we said, separate questions. One of them is to describe where does the intellectual actually fit today? And the other question is, where should the intellectual be? Where should the intellectual fit in this type of power structure? Should they be enabling the existing power structures? Or should they be fighting the existing power structures? Okay, we said that's one theme that we saw very clearly in the writings and in the thinking of a number of thinkers and philosophers and others. And we gave as examples Foucault, Michel Foucault, and Gramsci and others. The second theme that we looked at had to do with the question of expertise and specialization. And we said again that this is still, until today, a theme that is in motion. The idea begins with the question of the status of expertise in society, or the status of specialization in society. To what extent does a society respect its experts and its specialists? And of course, you can see the link with the intellectual or any specialist and expert in any field. And we said this is where we start to see very extreme views. It goes from one extreme to the other and everything in between. What was surprising is that it seems that many of those who have looked at the role of the intellectual did not conclude that the role of the expert and the status of the specialist should be respected and followed and praised and glorified. In fact, they said the opposite. And so we gave a spectrum of answers. We said first, there are those who were entirely and completely critical of the role of the expert and the specialist in society. And then there were those who were a little bit weaker, so we called it simply skeptical. They said we have to hesitate. We have to take it slow. It can't just be blind following. But we certainly saw a number of those who were entirely opposed to, very critical of, how society has glorified and praised and followed intellectuals. And we saw a number of reasons for that. We presented them from various angles, how different authors have focused on, different aspects of the work of intellectuals and where we may be critical of that type of work. That they do not have skin in the game, as we said, that there is no real accountability, no real consequences to completely abstract theoretical outputs when they are not associated in any way, shape, or form to the actual consequences of their ideas, for instance, or that they may be inconsistent with themselves. Their theories, their lives may be inconsistent with what they preach or the ideas for which they may become popular, for instance. We saw a lot of the these examples, or we saw the attacks that came from those who lived certain difficult circumstances in life, wars and revolutions, where a lot of this was initially triggered by the thinking from intellectuals, and then with time the same ideals and lofty principles that these intellectuals were preaching and presenting to the world, those intellectuals were now asking people to break away with those and to go against them. And so there were internal inconsistencies, internal contradictions between what the intellectuals were initially saying and what they were saying now, which led to bloodshed and violence and so on and so forth. And especially we explained a little bit of the context in Europe and elsewhere. And so we saw some of the reasons why and the angles from which the status of the intellectual, the status of the expert and the specialist was being attacked in society. So we went through the works of Paul Johnson and Thomas Sowell and Albert Camus. And then we had a whole discussion on, to complement and to complete that discussion, we discussed maybe a softer critique of the role of the expert and the intellectual from two angles the last time we met. Because this is also in part of the critique of the intellectual, but not a direct critique. It's not as strong. The first one had to do with, the praise of the generalist versus the specialist. And that the person who specializes at least too early or too much starts to lose the ability for interconnections in their minds. And because of their lack in life experience, because they're so focused on one angle, one aspect of life, and this is part of expertise and specialization, or at least in the thinking of many, this is what specialization and expertise looks like, they actually lose. They actually become less accurate in their ability to solve problems, in their ability to remain resilient, in their ability to find real solutions, creative, innovative solutions to more complex problems. We saw the whole discussion around that, and we used as an example a book titled Range, where it's basically in praise of remaining a generalist for longer, showing that many of the greatest experts and specialists are in fact a lot more generalists than we may think, that they master more than one field, and this is most likely what allowed them to be so good in their field, is their access and their expertise and their mastery of multiple other fields where they can draw inspiration and learn and experience from other areas of life into their area of specialization and interest. And they might become very famous for it, and the other areas, no one ever really knows about them. It never comes into the spotlight, for instance. So that discussion was more about an indirect, as we said, critique of specialists and expertise, that we don't want experts to be kind of one-dimensional or unidimensional, that generalists have a place, and those who master and who know and who are experts in multiple fields are very beneficial. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of documentation and research and studies to show that they may in fact be a lot better than the specialists in their area of specialization, and we gave some examples of this from geopolitical and strategic analysis, for instance, and other areas. The second discussion that we had, also the softer critique of experts and specialists, had to do with the tension between the individual and the collective. And we said that generally speaking, when we're talking about the intellectual or the expert or the specialist, what comes to mind is the image of an individual human being. And so we saw a lot of literature, and it was just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more. But we saw a lot of literature in praise of the collective intelligence. That human beings are a lot better when they put their minds together. And in fact, they achieve better results by putting their minds together, even if their minds are not the minds of specialists. Their minds working together lead to better results than the individual mind of the specialist, even though he or she may be a specialist, the top specialist, the greatest expert. Usually, human beings working together will reach better conclusions. And so, there's a lot of angles to this, but in short, that was the idea. And of course, as we said, we're not saying any of what we're presenting is the truth, as we keep saying. We're simply going through the literature to see some of the conclusions that these thinkers have reached. All of this needs to be analyzed further in a critical way to see what we accept and what we do not. A lot of this, in fact, has a lot of generalizations. All of this needs to be conditioned. We need to add caveats and conditions and restrict the discussion in a certain way. It might be true in certain cases where people working together will be better able to reach a creative solution than to look at a specific individual expert, but that will not always be the case. Sometimes you put 100 or 1,000 minds together, and given enough time, they will still not reach the right conclusion or the right solution, and one expert can do all their work in a few minutes because they have that expertise and that ability to solve, because they are a specialist, because they've gone through this, because they've studied, and they, in a lot of ways, have the combined intellect of generations and generations of human beings who have looked at this, right? And so it's not that easy to say just by putting human beings together, we're going to be solving questions and complex issues a lot faster, in a more creative way, and in a better way. We have to see in what fields, what types of questions, what types of situations are better handled by the mind of the individual expert, and which ones are better solved by the minds of the collective, even though they may not be the specialists. And perhaps, of course, the ideal solution would be to find a way to involve the experts with everyone else, and then you have the balanced answer, but we'll come to that later, inshallah. Okay, so we said there's a whole discussion about, it's not a direct critique or an attack against the expert or the intellectual or the specialist. It's that perhaps we shouldn't only look at the individual expert or the individual specialist. We also have to have a place in society for the collective work to happen together. Of course, the main condition in the serious works that had to do with this, the main condition had to do with the biases. I'm not falling in the biases of groupthink and mind, the crowd, the mind of the crowd, and so on and so forth. And we talked a little bit about this, mentioning some of the works throughout history, human history, where many of the thinkers in human history were very critical of the collective mind. And they showed that human beings lose their identity, their true intelligence, their ability to be critical, to be themselves, to think like they truly think, their full capacity of thinking and thinking critically. They lose that when you put them in a group. They rely on each other, they become lazy, they are under the influence of others, they don't want to stand out, they don't want to be in the spotlight. We talked about all of that, the echo chambers and so on and so forth, which leads to, generally, according to those thinkers, a weakening of the human mind. Bad, poor results, catastrophes and crises, right? And we went through some of the works, fiascos, as some of them put it in their titles, when human beings are simply working in groups. The delusions of crowds, as they call them, the illusions or the delusions of crowds. They create a reality for themselves, does not really match reality, and they all feed off each other and they react to it and so on and so forth. Okay, so we saw that there's a whole literature around this on both sides, right? So you have the individual and in praise of the collective, and then we said to balance the discussion, we have to keep in mind, by the way, throughout history, this is not a very popular notion. The popular position in history was very critical of the collective mind, very critical of the masses, right? It started to shift a little bit in the past few centuries when suddenly democracy became a good thing. If you want to study the history of political thought, there was a reason why, in previous times, you don't really find a lot of societies that were democratic. Because the main thinkers, those who held the authority and the control, did not think that any good will come out of everyone thinking together. The majority of people are not equipped to think about these complex, real issues. So we should not be leaving it to them to make any decisions that have to do with the whole state, for instance. It's too complex for them. Let them live their simple daily lives, and those who can are the ones who handle these more complex, real issues that a state, for instance, needs to worry about. Hence, they come up with all sorts of regimes, right? A regime where you only bring specialists, a technocracy. A regime where you bring those who are most powerful, right? The oligarchy. A regime where you bring descendants, a monarchy, right? You have a king or a queen, and that's how that family is just, off limits. They're special, they're anointed, they're however you want to deal with that, and that's it. That's what you put in place. But in all of these regimes, the idea is certainly not that we are going to listen to the masses, right? And this has been, generally speaking, the trend in human history. It's only very recently that we are starting to see a lot more in the past couple of centuries, since the Enlightenment, since the fall of the monarchies and the fall of the church and the movement to individual rights and human rights leading to democracy and so on and so forth, that suddenly there's a lot more place given to mass thinking and the collective mind. And then we associated that directly with evolution that is happening and a transformation that is happening in society at the technological level, because this came at the same time as the internet. And people starting to realize what networked minds can do. So really, this should perhaps be a lot more targeted and a lot more conditioned and a lot more well-defined as a discussion than simply saying the collective mind is always going to be a lot better. Right? And we said this continued for, perhaps a generation of time, a couple of decades. A lot of the works that came out, anything that had to do with the individual versus the collective, the general trend was, and the popular trend was, that the collective mind is the mind we should move towards. We should network the minds of human beings together. It leads to amazing, very good results, beneficial, desirable results for the individual and for the collective, for the business and for politics, for the family and so on and so forth. And then we said we started to see the shift afterwards. And the shift was, or it happened suddenly, when those who are in positions of power, those who were in the positions of, let's say, the dominance of their worldview in society, started to see that suddenly society is not going in that direction. And we said there's 3 events that happened one after the other very quickly in a very short period of time. And a lot of the literature that came out, a lot of the writing and the thinking that came out, that was now suddenly critical. Overnight, we were now back to being critical of the mass mind and the group think. And those were Brexit and Trump coming into power and around the time of COVID. Those 3 events, the combination of those 3 events meant that if you look at the type of literature and the books being published and the articles coming out and so on and so forth, a lot of it now was very critical of just letting society think for itself and the masses just giving them the information and letting them think for themselves. Suddenly we were critical. So now this reveals that a lot of this is in fact only a reaction to things happening, which is usually the case in all ideas in human history. There are things happening in society, and the thinkers are reacting to those things. So we have to always take a step back and see, but is the idea in itself good or not? Valid or not? Before we only look at the context in which it's coming out and what are they reacting to and who benefits in what situation and who doesn't. And then this will allow you to much better assess these ideas. In any case. So now that we went through all of this, inshallah, today we are going to continue and try to finish this second theme related to expertise and specialization. And I'll try to also wrap up quickly the third theme that was left. We said there's 3 themes, right? When we look at all the Western literature that has come out, there's 3 main themes. First is power structures. The second one has to do with expertise and specialization, and we have to try to finish it today. And the third one has to do with what I called engagement, or what we can call activism for the intellectual. What does that mean? Okay, so inshallah we'll try to wrap up that discussion today, and then with that we would have finished what the West has had to say about the role of the intellectual, and then we'll move to the Islamic world and to see to what extent all of this has reappeared and resurfaced in their writings, or perhaps it's other questions that arose, and then we will try to come back and synthesize all of this in a way that makes sense for us, and then we'll wrap up this question of the intellectual in a community of an Islamic community of knowledge. So, let's come back to the expertise now. So we looked at the point of view that was critical of the expert, and we went through all the different angles that were addressed. We said it would be unfair to leave the discussion there, even though initially I was going to do that, to leave the discussion there because it might give the impression that all those who have talked in favor, or all those who have talked about expertise and specialization that we presented were critical or at least skeptical of experts and intellectuals. So that may give the impression that that's all there is out there. So we simply want to complete and complement the discussion by presenting the other point of view as well with a couple of works. And now, so this is the idea that no, we have to come back as a society to the experts. And we have to respect expertise, and we have to respect specialists and intellectuals. They have their place. So these were looked at from also a few angles, from different angles. In one book in 2001 called Public Intellectuals, A Study in Decline, by an author by the name of Richard Posner. Richard Posner is all for intellectuals and all for experts. But the title that he gives is Public Intellectuals, A Study of Decline. So what he is lamenting, what he's concerned about, what he's preoccupied about, is that the intellectual is losing his status in society. There's a decline in what the intellectual was compared to what the intellectual is now. That's the issue. Otherwise, this clearly would mean that his position is we need experts and we need intellectuals and we need these specialists. Except that if we look at the situation today, as things stand today, there's been a decline. That's a premise of the book. There's been a decline in that role. So he talks about the diminishing influence and the diminishing effectiveness of intellectuals in society. That intellectuals are no longer able to influence like they used to, and they are not as effective in influencing as they used to before. And he says that it's not that we don't have intellectuals who talk and engage in dialogue with the public anymore. We still have some of those. And he says that that role has always existed, and that role is crucial, necessary in every society where there are intellectuals who are always engaging in dialogue with the public. They are present in the public. They are sharing their opinions. They are bringing attention to issues. They are analyzing issues publicly, and so on and so forth. He says the way it is being done now is not the manner in which it was being done before. And so the consequence of that is that we no longer have the same role that intellectuals used to play before that we are finding now in society. That role has declined. That role has eroded. And so the rest of his work has to do with what are the potentially, what were the factors that led to the decline of the role of the intellectual in society. And he talks about how today, it's not necessarily that there's a lack of education. There's a lot more people who are a lot more educated than before. So we cannot equate the intellectual and the effective intellectual and the public intellectual simply with someone who has knowledge. Because today there is knowledge. Today there is expertise. In fact, there's a lot more of it than there used to be before. And yet the intellectuals have been in decline, and their role is declining. Their influence is declining. So what is happening? He says it's a combination. So he talks about how everything now very quickly becomes politicized. So in general, that is true. And when something becomes politicized, you no longer focus on the actual issue. Now there's an emotional attachment to it, an ideological attachment to it that makes you take a position before knowing the full truth and standing with whatever is the truth, right? That's the issue with politicization. But of course, he's talking about the reality of America, the reality of living in the United States, where this is much more true than elsewhere. But this is a generalization that we can generally accept. Okay, that's one. Two, he says the issue today, and he's writing in 2001, he says the issue today is that specialization or expertise has become extremely narrow. Like today, you wouldn't be able to say, I'm an expert in biology. But before you could. You can't say, I'm an expert in medicine. Before you could. Today, medicine is a gigantic field. No human being can pretend to be an expert in medicine writ large. You're an expert in an area, and most likely in a very small area, in a very narrow area in medicine. You probably spent 4 years studying cells. You probably spent 10 years studying neurons. You are an expert. You know a lot about it. But you're focused on a very small, narrow area. Engineers, same thing. There used to be a time when you are an engineer. Today you can't just say I'm an engineer. You're an engineer with a specialization in something. There's too much to know. The rate of knowledge is moving too fast, and it's impossible to keep track of all of it. So when people become experts, they become experts in a very narrow place, very narrow topic, question, issue. Does it really need to be that? Well, this is where his attack against the university comes in, where he says this is the reality that we have created in our academic disciplines. Perhaps there is a way to come back to the question of the generalist versus the specialist, and when should it happen and how should it happen. And by the way, this is a discussion that we have in Islam too. Okay? The idea of specialization versus generalization and your ability to connect between the different fields. And so on one side, he's saying, yes, it might be true that there's a lot more knowledge that forces now people to become experts not in everything, but it's something specific. Otherwise, you're not really an expert. And to truly become an expert, it takes a long time to master that one field. But perhaps some of this is also created and the result of how we have created our universities and our academic disciplines and how research is funded and so on and so forth. So there is an indirect attack here against how universities or the academic world, which produces these intellectuals and these experts and specialists as a first-rate producer of these people. There are other places to produce them, but this is the main one. So it's a critique of that. And this is very important, by the way. When you read, this is a kind of sub-theme, and I'll come back to it a little bit later. The idea of education. So when we talk about the intellectual, we also have to talk about what got them there, what made them into an intellectual. Where did they acquire their tools and their knowledge and their expertise? What led to all of that? Which brings us to the whole question of the system of education, or the theory of education behind all of this, and what should people learn? Where should the emphasis be? Which is the next main heading in our series, by the way. The types of knowledge that Islam says go and learn. Right? So anyways, that was the second part of his discussion. So he says everything is politicized, very narrow specialization, combined with now intellectuals talking about topics, speaking on matters they are not qualified to speak on. And this is something we saw and encountered in earlier works as well. And so he says the combination of this has meant that their status and the appreciation of society of these intellectuals has declined with time. And social consequences of all of this, the public has lost its ability to understand matters in depth because it's no longer listening to these. Intellectuals present something worthy of being listened to, something of value to the public, right? So this is, to him, a disastrous consequence, and it leads to very poor decision making. So you no longer have an ability to say, truly all of society agrees that we should move in this, or the majority in society truly agrees that we should move in this direction. Because the majority of the people do not fully appreciate the nuances and the details and the complexity of the question. And so you have other factors influencing where the decision is taking place and the direction that society is going. And all of this is a lot, in the way he writes, contrasted with the past, where there was less formal education, yet there was what he calls more knowledge and more wisdom, especially from the public intellectuals, those who did engage with society, those who took a place in the public, among the public, to speak to the public and to engage with the public. And so, to summarize all of this, the title says it a little bit, a study of decline. The idea that the role of the intellectual has declined. I think there's some of these questions or issues that he's bringing up that are perhaps relevant to us in our discussions as a community. What does that mean? Can we really draw a parallel? I leave it to you to think about. Is it true that our intellectuals, our specialists and experts had a more prominent role, were more effective at influencing in the right way, in a positive way, the communities in the past versus the present? Is that truly the case for us as well, or perhaps it doesn't apply in the same way? If there is a decline, then what contributed to it, and what do we need to do about it now as communities? Okay. The next book, very important one, 2017, it's called The Death of Expertise. So the full title of the book, The Death of Expertise, The Campaign Against Established Knowledge and Why It Matters, by Tom Nichols. It's a well-known book. So the author argues that society is now witnessing a decline of trust in experts. That's why his book is called The Death of Expertise. It's not that expertise is dead. He says, is that people are no longer trusting of experts as they used to be before. And so the rest of the discussion is then, what is leading to this? What does this lead to, and what has led to this situation? So he says that this is mainly driven by factors like the internet, media proliferation, so social media, and certain educational practices. Okay, I'm gonna try to go fast here because there's a few more books that are in the same vein, and I'll add them to make the point is not this book specifically, but this one is one that people should know about. Okay, and so he says that all of this has fostered a overconfidence from people in their own knowledge, even though they are not experts. And this is combined with sentiments of anti-intellectualism, where in society in general, people are against the intellectual. If you happen to speak in a certain way or go in a too complex way in your analysis, your presentation, there's already walls that go up. Why? What has happened in society that has led to this? Okay? And so all of this means that people are favoring their own opinions and what he calls their ill-informed beliefs. Okay? So he explains that this trend has roots in things that lead to social and political threats. Society will crumble eventually, and the political system will crumble. And we saw the same argument presented right before by Posner, right? That people are no longer, if they do no longer really listen to the experts, you might just listen to the politicians. Without really knowing, the politicians can be very, very convincing and very manipulative. And then there's lobbying behind them, and there's money, and those who have money and who have power will maintain it, and you will get manipulated. All of this because you never really understood the issues in a way that you can see yourself in them and use your vote and use your voice to get society to move where it needs to move because it represents the interests of the majority. That's his point here, or his argument when it comes to the political level. And so this is going to, diminishing respect for experts is going to have serious repercussions for democracy, he says. Okay, and then he talks a little bit about the Dunning-Kruger effect. So these are two researchers who looked at how human beings tend to, the less knowledge you have about a topic, the more you think that you are an expert in it. And so, they took groups of people, and usually those who were in the bottom 12 in terms of knowledge about a topic also considered themselves to be in the top percentiles in knowledge and expertise in those topics. And the corollary of that, which they also demonstrated in a lot of studies, is that as your knowledge of a topic increases, this is going to lead to you understanding and knowing much better how much you don't know. So you start to, when you are asked, how much do you know about something, that number will start to go down lower and lower as your knowledge in that area increases. So you can see the danger that those who know more start to really understand that they really do not know that much, and those who know nothing consider themselves to be the experts. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. And it goes very far. There's a lot of ramifications to this. You can show it in very simple examples. They say when you ask the majority of people, do you consider yourself to be a good driver? 80% of the people consider themselves to be above average. Well, clearly, this cannot be. This is impossible. If 80% of the people consider themselves to be above average, average would be 50, you're 50% good, but 80% of the people consider themselves to be above average. So mathematically, there's an issue which reveals exactly this type of thinking, that you overestimate your knowledge, your abilities, your expertise, your capabilities, and you rely on them and you live your life that way. And there is nothing forcing you, encouraging you to go seek more knowledge and more specialization because you're already there. You already know what you need to know. Why would you go and spend time and money and effort and energy to learn more when you're already in the top percentiles in all of this? You know enough. And so the real danger does not only come from not knowing and overestimating, it's also from what is usually called double ignorance. It's not only that you do not know, it's that you do not know that you do not know, or you do not know what you do not know. It's not even on your radar to say, I know nothing about this. This does not exist in your world, so that you can say, I don't know anything about it. Right? And so this is that whole, the Dunning-Kruger effect is well known, studied in psychology and other studies. So this can lead to dangerous consequences to him, of course, as what he calls the rejection of science-based evidence and the rise of conspiracy theories. And this is where you start to see, this was published in 2017. That's why we always say you have to link what is happening and what is being published and how it's being presented with what is happening in the world to really have a much more nuanced way of being able to analyze it and its validity. So the author explores the growing distrust and disregard for experts in society, and he argues that this is a phenomenon that is fueled by these four factors. So the democratization of information. This is a technical term. That information is now accessible to anyone. So anyone can look for anything. And if you looked for it and you read an article or two or three, then of course you're going to be considering yourself an expert in it because you've read 3 articles about it. Okay, so this is a democratization of information. The rise of anti-intellectualism. It's now a thing in society. So there's a trend, a cultural trend that celebrates ignorance and dismisses expertise in society. 2, the decline of critical thinking skills. Most people do not have the proper way of using critical thinking and critical judgment to apply it to situations and reach a conclusion. By the way, this is why when You study, for instance, in our seminaries in Hawza, one of the first classes that you take is mantiq, logic, formal logic. The purpose of formal logic, the way they define it, they say, أداة تمنع العقل عن الخطأ. It's a tool that will prevent the mind from falling into mistakes, or in logic and philosophy, we call them fallacies. It's the wrong thinking. There's a weakness or something wrong in the argument you're presenting. So this formal logic is supposed to be the tool to teach you how to identify that mistake right away when the argument is presented. It's like, oh, you're using the term in two different meanings. So it cannot be used in that way. The argument is not valid. Or here you did not, there's only 4 ways that you can use a syllogism and reach a conclusion. There's 3 of them that are valid and the 4th is not, because it's a generalization. You cannot generalize this way. And you did here. So they formally teach you all of this on day 1 when you enter into your Hawza studies. There's a reason for that. This comes from classical education too. This is from the time of Aristotle. This is how it was done. There is a reason why before you enter into knowledge, you have to know how to think critically so that you are able to distinguish between valid reasoning, valid arguments, and those that contain a fallacy or a sophism. You use the language in a way that leads to sophistry, right? So you're using the language in a manipulative way that leads to invalid conclusions, but that are very convincing to people. And you have to know how to identify the issue and explain exactly where the issue is, and is it something you can rectify in the thinking or not? That the argument entirely has to be thrown out. It doesn't work. Okay? In any case. So here he is talking about the decline in critical thinking skills. That people have lost the ability to think critically in a proper way. And so, of course, here again, he's talking about a lack of education in critical thinking and logical reasoning that makes people open to manipulation in this way. And then the 4th is the cult of personality. That we live now in a society and in a world where you follow people. And people have a cult. It's blind following. Everybody has their fans. And whatever comes out of this person is the truth. And we follow this person for whatever reason. Okay, so this is a cult of personality. That's why Imam Ali says, you do not know the truth by knowing the men. You know the men by knowing the truth. Know the truth and you'll know everything you need to know about the men. They might keep their minds, they might change their minds, they might keep the same belief, they might change their beliefs. What we're looking for is not the man, we're looking for the truth, right? Know the men. اعرف الحق تعرف أهله. You do not know the truth by the men, unless the man is Imam Ali alayhi salam. And that's the exception because the Prophet said, Aliyun ma'al haq. This is the exception. Ali is with the truth. And the truth is with Ali. That's it. That means that this is an exception to the rule. Otherwise, the Imam says, اعرف الحق. Know the truth, which now we know is Imam Ali. Know the truth, you will know its people. You will know when the person this is the right person to follow or not. Right? Know the truth. Don't know the person. We're not looking for people. In any case, so this is a cult of personality. And again, this is also something that, inshallah, we keep in mind when we talk about our own communities. Okay? And so Nichols, the author, he argues that the decline of expertise is going to have serious consequences for society, poor decision making, it's going to erode democracy, and this is the really big one, the erosion of trust in institutions. That people no longer trust the major institutions that run the state and that run the world. Okay, and so this is a catastrophe for him and people like him. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. And so he proposes or concludes by arguing that the most important thing that we can do as a society is to reestablish trust in expertise and the experts. And the way to do this is to improve our education systems, to promote scientific literacy. So clearly there's a very strong push for science and what science says, and the theories of science have to be accepted and agreed upon and applied as it is. If it is, carrying the label, the title of science, holding experts accountable. And this one, to me, he doesn't spend enough time on, because that's the whole issue. but it's not being addressed properly. And the last one is challenging misinformation. And I've talked, for those who have followed my lectures for long enough, about the danger of using this term of misinformation and how it can be very easily and vaguely used to put anything and everything we disagree with as labeled misinformation, and then you can attack it without really looking at its content. Just call it misinformation, and then it becomes very easy to dismiss. In any case, so here the idea was supposed to be that, we present this thinking as it is, what these thinkers and their works have said as they are. But I think it's worth adding a couple of things about this work specifically, especially because it was quite famous when it came out. A lot of people have read it and it's influential. So I'll add a couple of things. First is that the author is quite pessimistic about the future. He says, this is what we have to do, but it's kind of almost like a dead end. It's already too late for society and everything is crumbled and it's the end of the world because, people have lost faith in the trusted experts and the science and so on and so forth. And the way he writes his book is extremely condescending to basically anyone who's reading it, who might disagree with anything. If you disagree, you're probably going to be labeled all sorts of things by this author. And it's all full of generalizations. It's like if you agree with a scientific theory or a scientific position or theory, then that's it. You've already been labeled what kind of people you are, what kind of intelligence you must have, and so on and so forth. There's you go down the rabbit hole very quickly, as they say. Okay, and so clearly, he doesn't leave a lot of room for the valid questioning of official positions. It's as though, a position comes out, a policy comes out from an institution, that's it, it must be followed. Okay, but where is the critical mind in this? You were talking about using a critical mind. Perhaps there are weaknesses, perhaps there are mistakes. There are errors in the thinking, in the data, in the policy position. We didn't take everything into consideration. It might work for now, but it doesn't, or it's going to cause other problems in 5 years or 30 years, and so on and so forth. Where is the place for all of this to take place? This critical thinking, this other point of view, respecting the point of view of the others, leaving the room open, enough space for a variety of positions, even between the experts, and that's the problem. That now there's always a formal official position that is being recognized. Anyone who is a true expert in any field will know that there's pretty much nothing out there that is unanimously agreed upon. No matter what question you look at, what issue you study, you are going to find experts who agree and those who disagree and those who have a nuance and those who want to elaborate and those who want to add a condition and those who... Where is all of this in this discussion? If all of this is happening between the experts, which of the experts do you want me to follow? I want to follow them and I want to respect them, but they themselves have not all agreed unless you want me to recognize only this expert and not the others. Now we're going to have another discussion. And this is going to reveal a lot more about you than the position you want us to take. Right? So there is all of that. And then he doesn't really address too much the root causes of this issue. Is there today, in today's world, is there mistrust or a lot more mistrust in public institutions and institutions of experts and mistrust in expertise? Is there or not? Yes, there is. But the discussion cannot stop there. The discussion has to go one step further and say, so why is there mistrust today? A lot more than there was before. That discussion needs to be addressed directly as well. And one layer in this is that when we look at the positions of experts and intellectuals and specialists, there are a lot of cases in a world where you have access to information, you know a lot more of cases of mistakes and ignorance and false interpretations. Innocent, but still mistakes and still errors. And in a world where you have access to all of this information, it would be extremely unwise to ignore all of that and say, but they are an expert, so I just follow them blindly. What if it has to do with my health? What if it has to do with the future of my children? What if it has to do with, You just want me to follow blindly the expert because they are labeled an expert? I have too many cases now at my disposal that I have access to that show me that the experts have made mistakes. A lot of mistakes. That's one. Two, and that's why he was so critical of the democratization of information, by the way. And two, in today's world where we do have so much access to the information, we also know of a lot more cases where the experts cannot be trusted, not because of innocent mistakes, but because of intentional mistakes. Now we understand a lot more about lobbying, and we understand a lot more about manipulation and the politics and the marketing and the business of every decision that is being made, even though it may be labeled science, or it may be labeled, evidence-based. We understand a lot of this a lot better as opposed to before. What do you think the natural conclusion of all of this, the logical conclusion of all this, is that people are going to be more trusting of experts when now you've looked behind the curtain and you understand what expertise can truly mean? And you understand both sides of it, including the innocent mistakes, but mistakes still, and the ones that are not so innocent, and the lying and the cheating and the recalls and the disasters that have happened, whether you look at the car industry or the plane industry or the drug industry or and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is kind of missing from the whole discussion. And this remains an incomplete addressing of the issue if that part of the discussion is missing. If you want to address it, let's address it fully. And then we can talk about the root causes and what to do about all of this as a society. And perhaps there's a lot more accountability that has to be added now to those who are experts and those who have authority and those who are making decisions. If I can get away with anything and everything and pocket billions of dollars, most people in today's world, as we have seen case upon case, will take the billions, even if it leads to disasters. How do we prevent that from happening? Let's make sure that doesn't happen. Maybe people will be more trusting of experts, right? And so on and so forth. So that's the whole discussion. Very quickly, two more books that I wanted to mention. They're very similar in the same vein, but I want to mention them for a specific reason, both of these. The first one is called Post-Truth. And this is another important one, again, because of its title. You need to know what post-truth means. We live in a world, you will often hear this, you live in a world of post-truth. It's after truth. We used to live in a world that was all about the truth. Now we are after. It's a milestone in history. We're now after. It's the truth doesn't matter anymore. That's what it means. That's a post-truth world. Okay, and it's written by Lee McIntyre. It's a he. Lee is a he, McIntyre. And so again, the idea is very similar book to The Death of Expertise. So both books are addressing the issue of the decline of trust in experts, the rise of misinformation in contemporary society. There's a lot of shared themes. The distinctive focus of this work is that he focuses more on the cultural and the psychological reasons why people fall into this. And so again, this brings us back to what we call the biases. This is the more, modern scientific way of talking about some of the same questions that we saw addressed when we talked about the delusions of crowds, right? They're coming back to this now. That's why I talked about it earlier. That now they're saying human beings, when you put them together and they're influencing each other, it just leads to the decline of intelligence. And these are all of the reasons why. And now we have names for each one of these, right? Like this is an echo chamber, and this is a confirmation bias, and this is the Dunning-Kruger effect, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's one. The other aspect of it, so he talks about cognitive biases, the influence of political polarization, again, and the impact of media manipulation. So in all of this, there's a lot of overlap with the previous work. And maybe perhaps the key differences is that the tone of McIntyre is a lot more professional as an author, a lot less polemic and emotional, and he's a bit more objective and neutral and certainly less condescending than Death of Expertise. It's a little bit more measured, a little bit more academic. And he spends more time talking about concrete solutions. Okay, and so he talks about the importance of promoting critical thinking and how to do that, media literacy, fact checking. But the truth is, just between you and I, those things that he's proposing as solutions to deal with mistrust of institutions and mistrust of experts, they're the same things that lead to mistrusting experts. Because he talks about promoting critical thinking. It has two edges. It can lead to trusting experts more, or it can lead to mistrusting experts more, because you're using your critical thinking. Media literacy, same thing. The more people understand how the media works, they're going to be more trusting of the media or less trusting of the media. Fact checking. The more you do fact checking, you're going to be more trusting or less trusting. But in any case, these are the solutions and the program that he wants us to put in place to reestablish trust. And then the last one is Death of Truth. So again, you see from the titles of these books, Death of Truth, 2018 by Michiko Kakutani. This is a she. Another similar book. This time, she is focused a lot more on the politics, okay, the political dimension and journalism. So a lot of these works, clearly, as I said earlier, have to be associated with a certain timeline, with certain events happening in the world, right? So in this case, there is direct attacks on how can Trump become the president. This can only mean that there's a decline in the collective intelligence and wisdom of the people that would allow something like this to happen. And as we said, the same thing has been said about Brexit, the same thing, a lot more forcefully and openly than, perhaps in the past. Okay, where there are specific things that are happening in society, and there are those who are now attacking those things very directly by saying that this is all the result of people no longer trusting the true intellectuals and the true experts and the true specialists. This is the only reason why all of this is happening. And so there's an emphasis on the role of technology and social media, the reason why all of this is happening. There is an erosion of trust in institutions, again. There is a political manipulation of the facts. So therefore the consequences for democracy and civil discourse are horrible. And therefore the book ends with a call to action that citizens must resist the erosion of truth and support true journalism as a civic responsibility against propaganda. So with this, we've wrapped up theme 2. Now, depending on your level of resilience right now, I can try to quickly cover theme 3, or we leave it to the next lecture. So theme 3 had to do with the notion of the engaged intellectual, the intellectual who is activist. The question is, when you are an intellectual, when you are an expert, where you have the ability to analyze and better understand what is happening in the world than others because of your position, because of the tools you have, because of your education, whatever it may be, do you necessarily have to do something about it or not? And if you do something about it, are you still acting as an intellectual, or are you no longer an intellectual? Because the moment you do that, then you are no longer objective and neutral. You have to remain objective and neutral to remain a true intellectual. If you start to act and to take position and to protest and to dissent and so on and so forth, then you have lost the privilege of being called an intellectual, because you're no longer truly neutral. And so long as you are neutral, then you are a true intellectual. You are truly objective. And you are following the science, you are talking about it, you're playing your role in society. Anything more than that is overstepping, going beyond that role. Okay, so do we continue or do we stop here? You say continue. Okay. So I'll try to go quickly so that we don't spend too much time on it. And with this, inshallah, we wrap it up for today. And the next time we meet, we can jump into what the Islamic thinkers have said in return, by opposition. Very quickly, if we follow and look at Western thinking and literature and figures, we can go as far back as Socrates. He would be the first figure that we would have to look at there. So certainly Socrates is a public figure and an intellectual. And this is a man who, bottom line, is killed for the position that he takes. Clearly he is doing something in that society where there is a judgment against him that he has to be executed. He disturbs something in society. And they openly said he is corrupting the youth of Athens, right? The youth of ancient Greece. So ancient Greece has a certain ideology, a certain worldview. The youth are expected to behave and to think in a certain way. But because of Socrates, this is having an effect on them, and they are no longer acting the way that state wants them to act. And so he is identified as being the reason for that, and the judgment is execution. So clearly, he can be, for those who accept ancient Greece as being the origins of the Western culture, because that's a very questionable, debatable issue. Okay? But in any case, that's a completely different discussion. Inshallah, one day for when we study the history of human thought and history of philosophy, we can talk a little bit more about that. So the first figure is Socrates, and Socrates is a very, therefore, engaged public intellectual. That's one. I don't want to spend too much time. I think his story is well known enough. Plato. There's a lot that we can use in Plato. I will focus on one idea from Plato, which is the philosopher king. This is the theory that he presents mainly in the Republic, in his major work. It's called The Republic of Plato. He talks about it in other works too. And so he talks about this person who has very deep knowledge and very deep understanding and a very thorough, rigorous education that lasted a lifetime, that got this person to a certain level of maturity and wisdom and knowledge that makes them a philosopher who is suitable to become the king of that state. Okay, so that's the idea of the philosopher king. Who should rule a state, and in what, according to what type of regime, what type of political model should a state be run? That's what he's trying to answer as a question. And the conclusion is, therefore, we must have a philosopher king. So he has to talk about who is this philosopher king? How do we get there? So the characteristics of this person, this is a very, very lengthy discussion. But in short, this person has these characteristics of having the wisdom, the maturity, the very thorough education, and also certain characteristics. And some of these important characteristics include personal traits, that this person was never motivated by personal desires and interests. He was educated and trained to only think about the greater good of society, of others, and collectively what is beneficial to humanity or to the city, the way he talks, what is beneficial to the greater good, not for me personally. That's a very important state. Therefore, this person, he says, is a lover of knowledge, a true lover of knowledge. The person has very strong intellectual virtues, a lifetime of study and contemplation to protect against personal desires. Okay, so you can see the mixing up of, there's a dimension of this that has to do with how much knowledge you have and the cognitive tools you have, but another aspect of this has to do with your moral character. Okay, then he talks about how is this person chosen? Well, first, he proposes how this city has to educate those who are born into it. It goes even further. How are people allowed to be born into it? But those people are now born. They have to go through a very rigorous education system from the moment they enter into this world. And all of this is going to be, the strict, extensive education process from childhood is going to foster very clear natural abilities and show differences between people. And so you start focusing on those that show those abilities and you invest more in them and you put more efforts in them because this is your pool of potential philosopher kings. and you're looking for the best one among them. A little bit like, if you look at a beehive, for instance, or right? And so the natural abilities that this person has a natural aptitude for philosophy, for abstract, complex thinking, and for leadership. And the person is of a noble character, of great intelligence, a lover of truth, and so on and so forth. He goes through all of this. And then he says, one of the most important features of this person in order to rule is that they have to be very reluctant to rule. They have to be dragged into that position. It cannot be someone who wants to rule, because if they are, then that means they lack wisdom and judgment. That means that this is not the person we're looking for, if they wanted to become the ruler or the leader. Okay? So we'll never desire power for its own sake. They are reluctant to rule. They prefer a life of contemplation and a life of thinking. This is the person we're looking for. And so therefore, this person will have no choice but to carry the burden of the leadership. This is the person we're looking for. And this is someone who has to be convinced or forced out of duty to take and accept that position. And who's going to force that person? It's the guardians. Okay, so the city is run by guardians and headed by this person who is the philosopher king. Okay, and so that's his political theory that he presents in the Republic. But all of this to say, so therefore, the ideal intellectual in Plato's world is the philosopher. And should the philosopher be engaged or not? Yes, 100%, perhaps the most engaged person, the most activist person in the city or in the state, because they have to rule that state. Okay, so they have to be prepared and educated and trained to be prepared for that. Even though they might be very reluctant, this is part of their duty. They have to accept that as part of their fate, the burden of leadership and the burden of ruling, because of everything that they can bring to that type of position. So that's one way of, looking at this whole discussion. Now, we jump a little bit further to the time of the 1800s, mid to late 1800s, an author by the name of John Stuart Mill, very well-known British philosopher. He has a couple of works that are quite relevant to this discussion, even though they are written, 200 years ago or more. So he has one called Utilitarianism, and he has one called On Liberty. So some of the main key ideas in this is that the intellectual must be someone who is always advocating for individual freedom and always pushing social progress. And the idea of the individual freedom is extremely key and important at that time. This is the time when the monarchies are collapsing and democracy is coming into play. Right? So it's all about the individual freedom, the freedom of the individual, which means what? Which means that the intellectual has to be someone who fights for the others to have rights, even though those rights are going to be against him and against his own. Right? The more I give you rights and I give you space, the less space I will end up having. This is what John Stuart Mill says is the main role of the intellectual, is to allow everyone in society to have that full right and that equal right. And that's why he was considered a champion of human rights, one of the champion of women rights, one of the first. In his writing, it's very clear. So in any case, so he talks about all of this being led by the intellectuals. The true intellectual is therefore the person who is engaged, because they are the one leading the charge, so that all of those who do not have all of their rights in society get their rights in society. So this is not just a neutral description of reality. This is someone who is fully engaged, an activist fighting for the rights of others. Okay, and so he talks about how important it is to create an environment in society, to create an environment for freedom of thought or free thought. People should be allowed to think whatever they want. But that is only possible if the intellectuals create that space, so that people can truly think and be free to think and have and hold the ideas and the beliefs that they want to hold. This can only be done when the intellectuals come in and guarantee the individual freedom to do so. And those with knowledge and understanding, the intellectuals, therefore have a moral duty to contribute very clearly, to the well-being of society. Others completely disagree with this. He says they have a moral duty to contribute to make society a better place and to guide decision making. So he talks about how society benefits from a diversity of opinions, even though there might be opinions we disagree with. They have their place. He talks about the idea, this is a very important one, he talks about the idea of the marketplace of ideas. So at that time, it's capitalism. What goes in capitalism? No one should tell you you should sell or shouldn't sell. It should be completely open and free market. For those who have studied the initial works on capitalism, okay, the invisible hand of the market, you can take anything, any commodity, anything that has value and bring it to the market. No one should prevent you. No one should tell you do this and don't do that. The moment you intervene, you're giving too much space to the state. It goes against the main principles of capitalism. It should be completely raw, completely open to anyone to come into the market and sell whatever they want. And what will dictate the success or failure of something is the market itself. People are interested or not. What will dictate the price you're going to impose is not the law that you put, it's the demand, the supply and the demand. The more you can produce something, the smaller the price is going to be. The more demand there is for it, the greater the price is going to be. So the market will self-regulate. He says the same thing about ideas. It's like, let the ideas come into the marketplace of ideas, and it will self-regulate. The good ones will triumph. The bad ones will disappear. Don't intervene and prevent. Your job as an intellectual is to allow this marketplace of ideas to flourish, be completely open, be completely free of any restrictions from anyone to come up with their ideas. And so that was the main part of what he talks about, and he warns against the tyranny of the majority. And so this is another key notion in John Stuart Mill, the tyranny of the majority. The intellectuals, therefore, must defend minority opinions and protect intellectual diversity. Sometimes you have only a few people in society who want to hold a certain belief, a certain opinion, a certain idea. But because they are a minority, they are under the tyranny of the majority. The majority can attack them. Not because the majority is right in their beliefs and in their positions, but because they have the numbers. And just because they have the numbers, it will become tyrannical. It will become oppressive for the minority. So he says the intellectuals have a duty to defend the opinions and the ideas of the minority, to prevent from ever happening a tyranny of the majority. So you see the political environment in which he lives and what he's trying to promote. Okay, John Stuart Mill. There's a lot more that we can say, but let's keep moving. Jean-Paul Sartre, very famous existentialist philosopher, 1905 to 1980, I think. He was always considered, like in the French culture and society, if you were to say, like, who is the example, the epitome of the public intellectual, he's probably the first name that will come to mind, him and perhaps Michel Foucault, but him definitely even more so, Jean-Paul Sartre. And so he says, first of all, he was himself extremely engaged activist, and he talks about the importance of being committed to social and political causes. And he was openly himself committed to many of these causes. He talks openly and he writes about how the intellectual cannot remain neutral in the face of injustice. He talks openly about how intellectuals have to take responsibility for their ideas. So if you have an idea as an intellectual, you have to act on that idea. You show your belief in your own ideas through your actions. It cannot remain at the level of the idea. I have to see it in your actions that you truly stand behind this idea, and this is the consequence of your idea. It cannot just remain an abstract thing that lives in your head or at the level of your discourse. We want to see it in action. You have to live by the ideas that you push forward. The intellectuals must shape society, so very clearly as engaged as you can be, and they have to play a leadership role as responsible citizens. So you have everyone who is a citizen, they have a role to play. The intellectuals have to play a leadership role among the responsible citizens. And all of this is through, as he writes, through commitment and action in the world. So, if you want to take Jean-Paul Sartre as the example of the public intellectual himself, his ideas about the public intellectual is definitely one who is completely and fully engaged, not someone who simply thinks and writes and stays away from action. Edward Sayid. So I've talked a little bit about Edward Sayid in the past. He's a Palestinian-American thinker, literary critic, very, very famous for one work, even though he had a number of them. His main work is Orientalism. He's the author of the work called Orientalism. He also has another work called The Representations of the Intellectual. So he talks directly about the intellectual, and he is very critical of the role that intellectuals have played to create the situation that he is talking about in his work, Orientalism. Okay, so he basically says, who is the Orientalist? The Orient, right? So the Middle East, that world, Asia, so on and so forth. Where does that image come from? What is the Orient? How has it been presented in the West? So that work, the Orientalism, is all about that. He says it's a completely distorted, fabricated image, the reasons why it was done, who did it, and he goes through a lot of studies to show all of that. Okay, so in this other work where he talks about the intellectuals, he says that the definition of the intellectual is that it is someone who should be a critical outsider. You cannot be a true intellectual unless you are a critical outsider. You're always going to be an outsider because of this critique that you have to what you're looking at. Because of your expertise, this is how you're using it. You use your expertise to challenge the status quo, to challenge the orthodoxy, as he says, and speak out against the injustices that you know and see. And you see them a lot better than everyone else because you're an expert. Okay, so the description of the role, he says Western intellectuals, this is how it's applied in Orientalism, but this can be applied everywhere. He says Western intellectuals constructed and represented the Orient and the Oriental, the person, in a specific way through their tools. And the reason they did that is that they wanted to serve colonial interests. They wanted to continue to dominate the Orient through this representation. So your job now is to show that. Your job is to expose the role of intellectuals when they are being complicit and they are helping those who are oppressing others, being unjust to others. Your job is to show that they are doing that. And you do that through the tools that you have as an expert and as an intellectual. Therefore, intellectuals must examine their own role more carefully, more critically. He was, by the way, criticized a lot for Orientalism because he's considered Western, but he's also considered Palestinian. He's a Christian Palestinian American philosopher who lived in the West his whole life. He lived in the West his whole life. But he's attacking his peers and he's telling them that, this is a tradition that has led to, and this was intentional. And in some cases it's not, that's even worse. You don't even know what you're doing. But in a lot of cases you knew exactly what you're doing. You're driven by an agenda that is meant to dominate that other part of the world. Okay, so he received a lot of backlash for that in any case. And so that's why he says they must start by examining their own role. And they have to represent the voice of those who are marginalized and those who are oppressed. The intellectual is a figure of resistance, particularly against colonialism, imperialism, and forms of cultural and social domination. Intellectuals have to challenge power structures from a position of moral and ethical responsibility. Okay, so this is a position of Edward Sayid. There's another thinker, a Czech thinker, who was known to be kind of a thinker, a playwright. He wrote fiction, he wrote non-fiction, and also became very politically active. And then he became the president of Czechoslovakia. And then after the events of Czechoslovakia, the regime changed, the country changed, it became the Czech Republic. The name changed, right? It went from Czechoslovakia to the Czech Republic, and he was also I don't remember if it was, I think president, not prime minister, he was president during that time. So a couple of years before and a few years after, and then he died. And so he has an essay called The Power of the Powerless, 1978, The Power of the Powerless. So I think it can be very interesting for this whole discussion of the intellectual. So in there he talks really about, his main point is to criticize totalitarianism. He wants to show how a totalitarian, a tyrannical regime is going to work. How does it remain in power? How does it remain successful and be able to control populations in this way? That's what he's interested in his works, including this work. So he talks about something called living in truth. This is only possible when people are not living in truth. They live in lies, or they live in falsehoods, as he says. I don't even know if I said his name or not. It's Václav Havel. Okay, he's well known for those who kind of come from that area of the world, or who follow, literary studies and so on and so forth. He's a well-known figure. Otherwise, you may not have heard of him. Okay, and so that specific work of his, the Power of the Powerless, was extremely influential in Europe when it came out. It gave a lot of food for thought to people. And so his main idea is, when you are in this type of tyrannical regime, totalitarian regime, you're not really allowed to think, you're not really allowed to act like you want, what can you really do as an individual? And that's why it's called the power of the powerless. Who are the powerless? It's the normal citizens. They have no power, especially in a totalitarian regime. But that's exactly the point. The power of the powerless. You do have power. You've been convinced, they're trying to convince you that you have no power. They're trying to brainwash you into thinking that you are powerless. But you do have power. And so that's why the essay is called The Power of the Powerless. So what can an individual really do? Is there anything or not? So how do authoritarian regimes work? And he emphasizes the idea of rituals. He says they work a lot through rituals. They create rituals in society, and people just go through the motions, and they just repeat the motions. And those motions by themselves should be meaningless, should not really have that much significance. But in that world, they are given significance, and they become all of life. You go from one ritual to another. They're empty rituals, but those are the rituals that maintain that political regime in place. So long as you just go through these motions, you allow that status quo to remain in place. And so people, by going through these motions, by continuing to feed into the rituals, he says they become complicit. You are a partner. You are the one maintaining this structure in place because you're participating in the ritual. Just by being neutral, you're not being neutral. Just by doing as you're told, that's it. That means that you are feeding into and participating and contributing to the power structure that is oppressing you, and you're then complaining about it and saying that this is oppressive and this is injustice against me. So he says, do not participate in things you know to be lies. And this is the key. Do not participate in things you know to be lies. And this is where it was very famous. Even if there's pressure from the powers to do so, do not parrot slogans. And then he talks about a grocer, a store owner, who goes to this is how the essay actually begins. He puts a poster on the window, the front window of his store, a sign in front of his store, and he says that this is the difference between living in truth and living in lies. The poster has something about, we need to protest. This is unacceptable and we need to, but that's all the person is willing to do. That I put the poster, and this therefore is going to save me, and I no longer need to actually protest. I don't need to do anything anymore because I put the poster up. And that was enough. And that was my big act, that I put the poster and I do nothing else. So in any case, he talks a lot about this. He says, even if you do not believe in the poster, or in this case, he put a poster that says the opposite. It was both. And he says, even if you do not believe in the poster that you're being asked to put up, you are participating in the lie, perpetuating the lie, allowing the lie to persist. And therefore, after all of this, the point for us is he talks a lot about the role of the intellectual in all of this. So he said the role of the intellectual Intellectuals, especially in society, he says, must take a position. This is beyond the personal responsibility. This is beyond the moral courage. We expect the personal responsibility from everyone, but you're an intellectual, so we expect a lot more from you. He says intellectuals are unique. They have a responsibility to act as a catalyst. They are the ones who have to trigger others into social change and into maintaining moral integrity. And then he talks about, three dimensions of their responsibilities. He talks about moral responsibility, and Chomsky will take the same arguments later, by the way, that given their education, given their social standing, given their ability to articulate complex ideas, because of all of this, they have a moral duty and responsibility. They have tools that others do not. That's one. Two, independent thought. He says intellectuals have an ability to create spaces, real spaces or metaphorical spaces, to create environments, to create conditions for people to think in a different way. This is a power that intellectuals have. They can create a condition for people to think something outside of what they're being fed to think, manipulated to think. If they are forced to think only one way and people want to think in another way, but they don't even know how or where to begin, the intellectuals have to be the ones who create that way of thinking differently. Okay, so he talks about this. He calls them parallel structures. There's a real structure imposed on you in a totalitarian regime, and then there's a parallel structure that the intellectual can create for you and you can participate in. And then he talks about, and I thought that's extremely interesting, he talks, therefore, the intellectuals have the ability to create independent communities for discourse and for different viewpoints and to discuss new visions of today and tomorrow, the present and the future. All of this because people are now thinking. People are thinking differently. People are thinking in a different way than the masses who are just still going through the rituals. Then, after all of this, if the intellectual is still just conforming, then they are a coward. So he says, and conformity is cowardice. So therefore, intellectuals, more than anyone else, cannot fall in apathy, cannot fall in indifference, because that's a form of self-delusion. They are deluding themselves. They have to be engaged and they have to contribute to a better society. Two more thinkers, even though they're probably the ones I should spend the most time on, but there's no time, so let's go quickly. First one, I want to now go back to Michel Foucault. And I talked about that when I talked about Foucault. I said that there's two Foucaults, for those who were listening. I said there's like two versions of Foucault. That's what I meant. I said there's two Foucault, Michel Foucault. One of them is the one who wrote his works, and those works got published. And if you only know books and published works, and you were alive at that time, that's the only Foucault you would know. You're just reading his works. And then he dies. And then a number of works appeared after he was dead, published posthumously. Those works go a lot further in the thinking of Foucault. They were based on courses that he taught, and specifically the last series of lectures that he delivered, which were part of a course. There's 6 lectures, and then there's other ones that were added to them, and those were published under a title, Courage of Truth. The Courage of Truth. It was published in French, and it was translated later into English, The Courage of Truth. So these were part of a seminar in 1983 that was called, his notes were Discourse and Truth, the problematization of Parrhesia or Parrhesia. That's a whole notion, the notion of Parrhesia. I'm going to talk about it in a second. Okay, so the idea of fearless speech, to be unhindered and unintimidated, to say your truth, to say the truth as it really is. And of course, he didn't create that notion. He's taking that notion from the Greeks. That's where the idea came from, but this is what he's analyzing. What does it mean? Where does it come from? And of course, therefore, because the whole course is called Discourse and Truth, he's talking about the intellectual. He's talking about the role of the intellectual in saying the truth, in saying their truth. And the truth of the intellectual should go a lot further than the person who is not, because they have more tools and they have more knowledge and they have more ability to go further in what they say. Okay, that's what he's trying to get at. So he is looking at the idea, he calls it truth-telling. So truth-telling as a social activity. To say the truth, the real truth, the truth that really matters in society, okay, as a role. What does that look like? And he analyzes that, and he says, so therefore the intellectual should have the courage to speak the truth and to challenge dominant ideologies. So now he's completely and bluntly open about the role of the intellectual. This was not the case if you look at his previous works. Here he's completely open. He calls it fearless speech, unintimidated speech, courageous speech. But this is not being done in a vacuum. This is not being done, I just talk to talk. I talk about anything and everything. And it cannot be done by anyone, and it cannot be done by about everything. This is stemming from paideia. So these are the two notions that go hand in hand, parrhesia and paideia. So paideia is a notion in ancient Greek philosophy meaning deep education. The reason why this person can have or must have the courage to say the truth is because of their deep education, which is the theme of our whole series. The reason why they are driven to say the truth is because they know. The knowledge makes them say the truth. The knowledge gives them the courage to say the truth and to be fearless in saying the truth. It's like it goes hand in hand. The more you know, the more you understand your duty and your responsibility, and you know what to talk about. And you know how to talk about it. That's what he's talking about. This is paideia. You need a knowledge and a wisdom of the world that is going to put you in a position to have the other notion, the notion of the fearless speech. Okay, so this is what he's talking about. He says to know deeply and to understand deeply the things that truly matter. That's how he defines paideia. And so the role of the intellectual, keeping this in mind, is therefore to expose contradictions, to show the complexities, to expose the blind spots, to challenge dominant beliefs and assumptions. And this starts with the self. So the intellectual has to apply all of this to himself or herself first. Self-reflection, self-critique, to critically examine yourself, your own beliefs, your own ideas, and to have the truth to tell yourself this is wrong and this is right. Then actually he calls it spiritual conversion. Before I can step into the space of having fearless speech, I have to have gone through the spiritual conversion, because I have self-examined, because I've applied that knowledge to myself. Now that I've done that, I can speak to others and talk to others about all of this. Okay, so you go through a spiritual conversion before trying to change the world. If you carry the right knowledge, the deep education, paideia, if you carry the right knowledge, then you must have the courage and the fearlessness to act based on what you know. And this parrhesia, today, we would say, it's a very common word, common turn of phrase, which is speaking truth to power. That's what it means. When you know that something needs to be said, and it could be very powerful if you say it, it's the truth, but it could be scary. It could have consequences. It could be very unpopular. Do you say it or not? No, there's a lot of power that comes with saying the truth as it is. Okay, that's the speaking truth to power, and it's very well known today as an expression. Okay, that's the exact same thing that it means. And so, by the way, this brings us back right to, because he's working directly with Greek notions from Greek philosophy, it brings us right back to Socrates. So Socrates is the perfect example of having had both the deep knowledge and wisdom and judgment of the world and the fearlessness to say it as it is. Okay? And so his position at the end is that the philosopher is the only person who has all of these tools to be able to recognize, understand power, and the power of truth, the power that comes from truth, and then act on it. Okay? So that's his way of understanding and defining the role of the true intellectual. That's how he says it. And then again here, not to spend too much time on it, it's just a quick remark. But you see again, when he had to talk about the role of the intellectual, he was forced to go back once again to the education that generated that intellectual. Paideia is the education system. It's a knowledge of the world. What is the knowledge of the world and the experience of the world that led to becoming that intellectual? And this is a theme that we've stayed away from because that would take a long time. But even in the West, like we could look at the West and, over the past 2 centuries, there's been a lot of work that even ask the question of what is a university supposed to be? Because that's supposed to be the institution that generates the true thinking and intellectuals of society. Supposed to be. So what is that? Is it really doing that work or not? What is the education system that we should expect from it? How should society engineer all of that process so that we generate the right minds? So I'm asking these questions because as a community, we need to be thinking the same way. How do we engineer the production of this type of education, of understanding of the world, of fearlessness to act and to speak truth to power, as we just said? What does that look like? And then, finally, the last one is Noam Chomsky. So, Noam Chomsky is a very well-known American linguist, philosopher, and political activist. So, he has a number of works. If you want to focus on 2, I would focus on these 2 works for this topic. One of them, I've mentioned it a couple of times, Manufacturing Consent. And it's a book, and it's a documentary, and it's very easy to find, and it's quite important. But the book is The Political Economy of Mass Media. Okay, very important. And then the most relevant of his works, which became a book and has been published a couple of times now, reprinted, republished, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, or Responsibility of the, I don't think there's the responsibility of intellectuals. So the first time it was delivered as a speech, written, and then it was republished in a more extensive format later, and it became kind of a booklet. But this has had an incredible legacy in America, in the American institutions and academia and thinking, and in the world. Who is an intellectual, and what should they be doing? Okay, and so this is if there's only one work, that would be the work to know and to read and to understand. Okay, if you want to look in terms of influence that it has had, this is the main work. And so he published that work because he was being critical of America's war in Vietnam. He was speaking out as his position against the Vietnam War. Okay, and so here he's criticizing the role of intellectuals in society, especially with regards to the Vietnam War. That's why a lot of people say that it became kind of a foundational text for this whole area of thinking. But I think we've shown that Chomsky is certainly not the first or the last to have talked about the role of the intellectual. It's just when people are not aware of what's in the literature, they tend to focus on what is a bit more famous. Okay, so he talks about how intellectuals are in fact a social elite. They are the elites of society. And therefore, they have a position of privilege in society. Not the same privilege that now we see that has entered into, the cultural lingo of today. He's writing in 1967. He says that the intellectuals have a position of privilege. They have been given things. And today they have made it all the way to becoming part of that social elite. Because of their education, because of their work, because of the information they have access to. In a lot of cases, he says the intellectuals are usually people working in universities. They have access to libraries and information, and they have the time, they have the resources, they have the education, they have all the tools to really invest into this type of positioning and to understand what is truly going on in the world. All of this comes with no responsibility. No, that's not acceptable. There's a huge responsibility that comes with this position of privilege, and this is, he calls it, a moral imperative, a moral necessity. This is not something open for discussion. It's a necessary moral obligation that you now have because you are part of this social elite. In society, you are in a privileged position. So intellectuals must start, their role starts by being watchdogs. They have to be the ones who look and analyze and understand what is going on, the surveillance, right, that is being done, the monitoring that's being done, questioning the use of power and information. Brings us back to, that's why I started with that, the theme of power structures. So he says their role is what? What are they focused on, these intellectuals? What are they looking for? In Chomsky's view, they are looking for two things. Focusing their energy on two things. Power and information. Who is using it? How are they using it? How do they maintain it? What do they accomplish with it? And so on and so forth, right? So questioning the use of power and the use of information. And the purpose from all of this, what they're doing is to serve the public. Responsibility, therefore, to speak the truth, to challenge official narratives, which is always going to come at a price, to expose lies, to uncover corruption, to combat injustice. I'm taking terms directly from the work, by the way, to provide a voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Okay? So therefore, there is no choice for this intellectual but to engage in activism and dissent. Very open, very blunt. And therefore, then he goes to remind the readers of what happened when the intellectuals didn't perform this role. For instance, at the time of the Nazi regime, or in Russia under Stalin, and the atrocities that happened, and the intellectuals were there, and they could have at least spoken out, and they could have at least done something, but they did not, and they remained silent, he says. And so this allows us to start recognizing patterns, and this cannot be acceptable to any human being. And therefore, we all must agree that this is the role of the intellectuals. Okay? Once we recognize that there are patterns. If the intellectuals stay silent, then these are the types of atrocities that will happen. This is how far things will go. And so therefore, theoretical critique is not going to be enough. And that's the punchline, right? Therefore, you have to do more than theoretical critique. You have to move into action. You have to act on what you think or know to be the truth. And so he's very critical of aligning with power structures. He says that true intellectuals are going to be adversarial. Otherwise, they are complicit. There's no middle ground. You are either with or against. You are either participating in the power structures or you are standing up to them, standing against them, exposing them. Therefore, he's critical of the things that contribute to the power structures, which brings us back to mass media and mass culture and political institutions. And so now you see both sides, right? Those who say you maintain expertise, you maintain the institutions, you maintain the power that exists, you recognize it, you respect it, you follow it, and then you have this other way of the main function and role of the intellectual is to look at those power structures, to see are they being used properly or not, how the information is being used, and to expose the lies, the corruption, the abuses, and so on and so forth. The last portion of this whole discussion is those who kind of stayed in the middle. So now I showed you both. I'll end with the ones who stayed in the middle. I'll take just 3 minutes to do this. The best example to me of those who stayed in the middle from this whole discussion, and they say you engage but, you do not engage but, is a very famous philosopher by the name of Jürgen Habermas. Many would say he's the top philosopher in the world today. He's won every prize in the world for thinking and his writing and so on and so forth, a German philosopher and a sociologist. One of his main ideas is what he calls the theory of communicative action. So he looks at the roles of everything that happens in society from the point of view of acts of communication. Okay, that's the foundation of his philosophy, or a huge part of his philosophy. And so he is focused on what is called in that world, and he writes about it, and there's book upon book that he's published about this. It's called the public sphere. So the public domain, the public space. Okay, what does that look like, and who contributes to it, and how does it work, and the power dynamics in it, and so on and so forth. And the importance, he believes in it fully. In a democracy, for it to work, you have to have a healthy public sphere. For all of this to work, what do we need? So this is where he starts to focus in, zone in on, yes, he talks about citizens, yes, he talks about the institutions of society, but he zones in on the work of the intellectuals. He says the intellectuals are the ones who are going to ensure that a society has the right and healthy public sphere. So the intellectuals have to engage in open debate with each other and with the public, and with reasoned debate. Okay, a debate that is based on reason, a debate that is based on substance and truth and so on and so forth. And this is how they are going to contribute to all of this, through their expertise, through their positions, through the formation of the public opinion. They teach the public opinion how to have critical discussion, critical discourse, and they are going to promote and facilitate rational discourse. So you see the point he's trying to make is that they, therefore, yes, the intellectuals are going to be critical. Yes, the intellectuals are going to be engaged, but engaged how? Engaged in creating a space, brings us a little bit back to John Stuart Mill, creating a space for people to engage with each other, to hold different points of view. The role really of the intellectual is to use their expertise and their ability to maintain a healthy, democratic, rational discussion between these divergent points of view. That's where the intellectual works. So that everything stays civilized and everything stays rational and society doesn't fall into things that are uncivilized afterwards. This means that the public sphere is remaining healthy with good discussion always taking place between divergent points. So you see the role of the intellectual is as an intermediary, allowing people to hold very divergent points of view in a way that remains respectful and good, because this is what a good democracy requires. Divergent points of view and so on and so forth. So he says the intellectual is engaged as a key intermediary and facilitator in all of these types of processes. I'll stop here. Inshallah, with this we finished the last theme. These are the three themes that, as I said, if they are understood in detail, then we can say we have a very good idea of pretty much the entirety of the literature on the role of the intellectual in Western literature. Power structures, the place of expertise and specialization, and the third one has to do with activism or engagement of the intellectual. So they go beyond the theoretical and into act on what they know in the world. We stop here, and inshallah next time we meet we can start to look at what Islamic thinkers have said or how they have reacted to this whole question of the role of the intellectual in society. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. وأنتم. If you have the energy for questions, I am more than happy. تفضلوا. Habermas, yes.
I don't think you mentioned that part, but I don't think you mentioned that part, but I believe, aside from them, the intellectuals acting as like mediators between the ideas of the public, like, does it include maybe not what we said, but also that they should pass it along, ideas?
Yes, so excellent question. That are they only acting as an intermediary for the ideas of others, or do they actually also hold their own ideas? 100% they also hold their own ideas. So that part, no issues that the intellectual is going to present their own ideas to the world. The question for Habermas is the how. The how is always going to contribute to or go against what the public sphere requires. The public sphere requires rationality and a civilized discourse that does not bring society down by having a disrespectful way of engaging, because it breaks what he's concerned with, which is the Communication Act. It's no longer real communication happening. And so the intellectual can bring about any of their ideas, and in fact, that's their job. And he says they have the expertise. They are the ones who are going to be bringing the ideas and the tools to analyze the ideas of others. But his concern here for the role of the intellectual is the how. So whether it's my ideas or yours, my real contribution is to safeguard and protect the public sphere by maintaining the Communication Act in society. Yeah.
If I may,
Yes.
where do you, what camp do you have more leaning towards? If I may ask this question, and why?
So are you asking specifically about a specific camp? Like we covered a lot.
Yeah, I mean, the two sides. One side says no engagement, stay neutral. The other one says it's your responsibility, you have to.
Yeah, so I think Islamically speaking, we are going to have no choice but to agree with the latter position and to say, of course, the intellectual has to be engaged. The intellectual will not have a choice to be engaged if they want to be true to the knowledge that they carry. And it's going to, this is based on our definition of the intellectual, which is everyone. Everyone who wants to be an intellectual can be an intellectual. Anyone who wants to engage in intellectual activity, which could be thinking, nothing more, is already bringing you into the sphere of the way, that's why we defined it so broadly. Okay, and so it opens the door to anyone in the community to be part of the community of intellectuals. Of course, the more tools you have, your background, your education, is going to make you a higher level intellectual, but that you are an intellectual is open to anyone. And earlier in the series, we had a series of lectures on action. And so a lot of this is based on your thinking and your knowledge, what you know and how you think. Both of these have to lead to action. Otherwise, it's not considered Islamic. This was the conclusion from that part. The question is now going to be how. How do I act? What's the most appropriate action? What form does it take? Yeah, that's a whole discussion. Act can take any and all shapes and forms. That's up to us to determine, or each person to determine. But we cannot, I shouldn't give the punchline, but I think the punchline should be very obvious. That of course we are going to agree with knowledge by itself means nothing. And just reasoning, theoretical reasoning by itself is going to mean nothing. In fact, as we saw earlier in the series, this will be used against us in the afterlife. That you knew and did not act. That you could and did not act. Maybe someone else does not know, but you know. So the more you are an intellectual and the more you know, the more you're expected to act based on that knowledge.
I have a follow-up question that maybe for later.
Yeah.
Can I jump in with like with I would say even with the neutrality isn't really being neutral if it's progressing the status quo, right? So it's you have that based on all the lectures on knowledge. If you don't do anything, there is no such thing as neutral. It's either you're progressing or regressing in one of the either a downward spiral or an upward spiral, right? So in all reality, neutrality in most cases, and especially if it's advancing the status quo, is an action in itself. So is it better or worse? And specific action. Remember a lecture of yours from a few years ago with Ghadir Qom, where what makes a Shiite different is that there is a stance made that no, Imam Ali is the truth, is the successor, and not being very neutral about it, where coming in a way where Ali bin Abi Talib alayhi salam, has a very good argument, and these other guys have a very good argument. I'm not going to rustle any further and just leave it be. Now you take an action in the opposite direction, even though you didn't do anything. So,
Yes, ahsantum. Muhammad, I see you. You're next. Very quickly, just so that's why that exactly the point of is there something really that we can call neutral or not? I try to make a point to go through them and to say there are some who have tried to say there is a neutral space, but all the thinkers who, especially the ones who have talked about either engagement or power structures, they say there is no neutral. I didn't say it that way, but I tried to get you to see it, that they say you are either contributing to the existing power structures and the existing state that you consider to be unacceptable, or you are fighting it. By not fighting it, you are contributing to it. You are allowing it to continue to exist. You are maintaining it in power. Different ways of saying the same thing. So is there really neutral? No, there is no neutral. Doing nothing is not neutral. Indifference is not neutral. Apathy is not neutral. And they wrote that, and that's why we read the words. And ahsantum for the link back to the position to take with regards to Ghadir, but Ghadir is, the symbol of it. It's, what does it mean to be a follower of Imam Ali alayhi salam? Is that you recognize him and not in a neutral way. There's no neutral. There's haqq and there's only batil. There is no neutral, like I can stand at equal distance between haqq and batil. It's not possible. There's either acceptance of truth or not, which is batil, period. So, ahsantum. Muhammad, fadlu.
So just a little bit to also like what came to my mind is that Imam Ali alayhi salam's quote that you mentioned in previous lectures. He says, "Man tasawa yawma fahuwa maqboon." Whoever's days are like similar or equal, that there is no difference or increase of outcome, you're doomed. So from what I get is that Imam Ali is describing that if it's to the public's eye that this is being neutral, if yesterday is the same as today, then I'm actually doomed, and it's like you said, it's a negative outcome. It's that you either, like you're either progressing or descending. However, my question actually, or my comment when you mentioned the theme of active and engagement, you mentioned the first figure, Socrates, and the second one, Plato, and you mentioned that the leader must be reluctant to rule, which means draft rule. It's interesting to know, but my question is, do they have like figures where they extract this like kind of experience from, or this point of view, or is it they're speaking from like a hypothetical point of view in a perfect world?
Okay, so Plato. So your question is, there are people sometimes who follow and they say we don't hear the question, so I repeat it in the mic.
So it's a very interesting point, because like me, from my experience and my learning, like the only figure that matched this description would be Imam Ali alayhi salam, because he was dragged to rule after the three first caliphates, right? And then following by Imam Hussein, who was kind of like, many letters were written to him to rule. And then in our time, which a lot of people seek for kind of answers and for that perfect figure who kind of change this, downhill of society's, train that's going downhill. So like I would see, like for example, like the dua of the Faraj, or like, repeatedly asking God for his reappearance would be like trying to drag him to rule, even though we could be like part of the cause that kind of put him in the disappearance, right? So from the Western point of view, what figures led them to kind of come to this or highlight this idea? Do they have figures or? perfect world where they like imagine that this is what it should be for the leader.
Yeah. So in short, the question is whether Plato, when he's writing about the idea of the philosopher king, had inspiration from real figures, or whether he was simply basing it on, ideals, let's say. I'm going to give two answers. The first one is kind of just based on the theory and what is available in the writing of Plato. Plato was very considered a genius for having written his works in this way. Plato he wrote his philosophy as dialogues that today we would call plays. They're called the dialogues. All his works are called the dialogues. Except maybe the last one, there's disagreement on the laws. It's called the laws. It's a little bit different. And he never finished it, or we don't know if he finished it, but what we have is not finished. He wrote dialogues. So in the dialogues, it looks exactly like a play. It's like, imagine a scene. The first character enters. He says, this is the name of the character. This is who they are. And then the second one enters. And then they have a discussion. And then maybe a third one enters. And he comes into the discussion. And all of his philosophical ideas are presented in this way by these characters. He never says, this is what I think, I believe, I don't believe. And of course, by the way, some people say, that this is because of what he saw happen to his master, Socrates. So he never dared to say openly, these are my beliefs. If anyone has any issue with what he's saying, Plato is saying, I'm just writing plays. It's like I made a movie and there are characters talking to each other. This character holds this view, that character holds that view. And they disagree with each other and they argue back and forth. This person brings their arguments, that person, and then a third one enters and they disagree and makes them see things differently. And then they may agree on something or not. But he, through this discussion, passed all of his ideas through what they have to say. So can you say really what Plato actually believes? Very difficult because of how he wrote his dialogues. In addition to, his style and how he uses language and all of that. That's one. So when you read how Plato writes, he's not, مثلا, today you might read a book where the philosopher or the thinker is going to talk about history. Right? And say like, I look at history and I extract a lesson and no, there is none of that. He might mention, one of his characters might say, but this happened. Did you not hear about the Atlantis? He talks about Atlantis. Today, for those who are interested in Atlantis, Plato is one of the first to have mentioned Atlantis, the city of Atlantis. Okay, so he says, and he presents an idea, but he doesn't present it in a way that you can say, this is happening in reality. It's a play, it's a work of fiction. The whole work is a work of fiction. The Republic is a work of fiction. There's characters talking to each other. He talks about the nature of beauty and truth and good and justice, and then how should the city be run? So he never talks about specific figures. So that's the first answer, period. Like if you were to study Plato in university and spend semester after semester reading his works and all of that, this is what would be the answer. There is no way to tell whether he is really referring to anyone or not. We would have to look outside of his works to see, is he drawing inspiration from anywhere or not? So I will take you outside of his work now. This is the second answer. The second answer is clearly Plato lived at a time and he went through all sorts of activities and political turmoil and so on and so forth. And he came from a family of politicians. His ancestors ruled Athens for generations. And so he was very interested in having political opinions. And he had his own school, and his own school produced thinkers and philosophers and people who were specialists in thinking. Right? And today those two words come to us from the school of Plato and Aristotle, by the way. Aristotle, who was the student of Plato, and then he went and opened his own school. Right? So you have today, in some places, you go, it's like a college or university, they call it a lyceum. Lyceum. Okay? That comes from them. And an academy, that comes from them. The Academy of Plato. That's the name of his school. And the Lyceum is the school of Aristotle. He went away and opened his own school, and that was the Lyceum. He was captured, he was sold as a slave, he escaped, he came back, he was hired to become the teacher of Alexander, the Macedonian ruler, so on and so forth. He is a man who had a very rich life. And so there is the easy answer we can give, which is he knows the history of Athena, he knows politics and the politics of the world and the history of the world, and it's very clear from the way he writes. Is he reacting to something specific? Very difficult to tell. Okay? Now, the jump is when you study the works of people like Mullah Sadra, in Al-Asfar for instance, he openly says that these people, if they were not themselves prophets, then at least they were well aware of the prophets of their time and they may have studied under them. And this is how Mullah Sadra explains the wisdom and the truth, and he says they lived at a very close time to the books of Prophet Musa alayhi salam and all the prophets who were being sent to Bani Israel. They must have lived at the same time as them. Because there are a couple of narrations, by the way, that say that Aristotle was a prophet. Whether they are authentic or not is hugely debated. Okay? At the time of the Holy Prophet. So that's why Mullah Sadra, who many consider to be the greatest, reformer of Islamic philosophy ever, and until today this is considered the highest point of Islamic philosophy that you can study today, is to spend 20 years preparing in order to study 20 years for Asfar, right? Asfar of Mullah Sadra, Asfar al-Arba'a. Or it's called in English, they translate it as the transcendental philosophy or the transcendental school, Asfar al-Muta'aliya. So beyond this world. Okay, so in his writing, he says, if they were not prophets themselves, then at least they were exposed to the teachings of the prophets who were living at their time and who were living before them. And that's why he emphasizes on this. It's very clear that all of the main figures of ancient Greece, they traveled. They went to Egypt and they went to Iraq. They went to Babylonia and they went to Egypt. And in those travels, it's very clear that they traveled to learn. If you study the life of Pythagoras, the Pythagorean formula that we all study, the equation to find the angles and the length, the hypotenuse and the triangle and so on and so forth, you study his life, he traveled. He went to India and to Babylonia and to Egypt. And then he came back and he was a sage, a wise philosopher, and he started his own religion, where people were only allowed to eat, beans and vegetables and nothing more, and they seem to have believed in reincarnation and, the whole thing, all rituals and religion and all of that. And the same thing can be said of others. A lot of their thinking and a lot of what exists today from what they were able to leave behind is directly related one way or another to religion. We're not saying all of it is truth or not, very difficult to tell. But clearly there are influences. So that's the long answer, indirect, but it would be, I think, unrealistic to say that there were no clear inspirations and that there were no clear references to people and to knowledge, to sacred knowledge in there. But more than that, I think it's conjecture. We have to guess, and maybe there's possibilities, but not more. Yeah.
Will we be discussing the avenues that produce these intellectuals outside of just institutions, or is that just pretty much, if you're not recognized by institutions, you're not an intellectual pretty much?
So we define the intellectual in a certain way.
Yeah.
But are you talking about what we want, or are you talking about as a critique of...
What we want, like if you see, obviously the universities produce intellectuals, but you have, let's say if we consider the power structure as a corporation, you would see or some of the intellectuals are quote unquote corporate shills, and then you have others that are like Noam Chomsky. There's obviously a clear difference between one and the other. It's just are the avenues that are producing these intellectuals, or is it just basically the critical mind and reading and looking and stuff like that?
So I was not, I hadn't planned to talk about the institutions or the education system that produces these intellectuals. Depending on how the full series go, there was supposed to be a theme on the Islamic education system much later down the line, or part of when we talk about the family. So either as part of, the education of children according to Islam and Islamic teachings, or we dedicate a full series just for the education system in Islam. One or the other, that was supposed to be one of the themes. But for now, no, I wasn't thinking of, unless there's interest in, but it will make it a lot longer. But yeah, that's why I only thought like at least I'd refer to it, because there's a clear causality between the institutions and the background, the educational and other background that produces these people. Or there's at least trends that we can see. There are things that produce certain things, and other things that produce other things. Yeah.
Okay, just to get a better picture, is it like Malcolm X as a figure? Is it very political, and in terms of the three themes, he falls more in the third theme, specifically in terms of dialogue with the public. Would he be considered an intellectual by our standards or by general standards, or no?
Yeah, so this is what my question to you is, when you say so by their standards. In some cases, I've told you what they have defined the intellectual to be. Someone like Malcolm X, I think all of them, with a few exceptions, would say he is an intellectual, because he's engaged in serious intellectual activity. He's talking about intellectual topics, and he's a public figure, and so on and so forth. There are very few who said it has to be someone who graduates with a degree from, but there are some who have said that. By our standards, 100%, he is an intellectual. And it doesn't have anything to do with the institution that produced you. So, and we're not focused on that at all, and that's why we defined it the way we did. So by our definition, and what we are interested in, is anyone who wants to engage in intellectual activity is an intellectual, period. You are more of an intellectual the more you have these tools. And the easiest way to get these tools is to go through a university, for instance, because they teach you this and they give you these tools, right? But it doesn't have to be. You're not forced to go through that line. Yeah. The follow-up or no?
I do, but it's more, it's also regarding Malcolm X in terms of, because one of, I think the greatest things that separate him from the other activists of his time was his ability to connect with the public. And he brings this up in his own book in terms of sometimes referring to some of them as race hustlers in certain aspects, or sometimes not connecting, even if they are on a very genuine path,
Mm-hmm.
is because they're very disconnected from the grassroots in terms of they live outside of these communities, or he stayed very connected to, as he calls it, the streets, in terms of what the street language is, what the daily problems are, and so on and so forth. So by that, to add a layer to the intellectual, is the way he lives his life is extremely important in terms of being a responsible intellectual,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like keeping a certain level of a humble lifestyle, or at least within engaged within a community, to keep up, like, and not be a monk and
Yes.
and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so the point to the level or the degree to which the intellectual stays connected to the people, and or become disassociated from them. Inshallah, we're going to talk about that, because the Muslim thinkers have talked about this point. One of the more than the Western thinkers, they do talk about this, and that's the problem with the elites. That's why I keep going back to the elite, is that there's a distance between the elites and the rest. But it doesn't go very far, their thinking. The Islamic literature goes further because they've identified this as one of the main issues that intellectuals have had. They have remained disconnected, or as they say, here they say it's someone who stays in their ivory tower, right? They stay disconnected from the people, and so they are not talking to the people. They're talking to their peers who are like them inside the ivory tower. I talk to you and you talk to me, and you write your book and I disagree and I write mine. And there are some people who read, but they are also inside the ivory tower, and it just circles here, while the real people are still having the real life and oppression and injustice and political systems. And that has been criticized a lot in Islamic literature, more than what we find in Western literature. So the way the intellectual is supposed to live, and then when we add the Islamic component to this, that's the other, inshallah, piece. But we'll see, in the Islamic literature, we'll just touch it very quickly, but you have both. I'm going to use a specific language now, inshallah it's understood. There is enough space or room given to the scholar, to the intellectual, to live to a certain amount with seclusion from the people, but not to the point where they're cut off and they don't know what's happening, or they're not at the service of the people. So both are present in the ahadith. But if you go back to the Islamic literature and what the thinkers have written, you see that it's been identified as an issue, and a lot of it doesn't have to do with the religious figures. They're really talking about the academics and the teachers and the university profs, and they're talking about those intellectuals. And they say they've been disconnected. And so many of them have had really good projects of reform and improving society and dealing with oppression. But those projects don't make it to the public. They stay in these circles until the person dies, and then two generations later, the books are everywhere and people are reading them, but they're not engaged with the people. Yeah. A little bit. I don't think we're going to talk about it a lot, but at the end of this, we have to compare. We are looking at what the West has said. Inshallah, we're done with this. You got a double lectures today, very long. And then there was the other side, which was the Islamic literature. We're going to go through that. Then, to conclude from all of this, we have to go back to the ahadith. We have to identify a few questions and go back to the ahadith and say, what did Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam say? What does the Quran say about these things? Now that we know what the issues are, what different people have come up with as solutions, that's when we will finally say, therefore, this is the model or the general sandbox in which we should try to operate as a community and as intellectuals in a community. Yeah. Inshallah. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.